Okay, so we're continuing on with the book of Revelation. We are now getting into chapter 4. We're going to start the third section of the book of Revelation, the things which will take place after this. Where does that concept come from? Well, this comes from our outline that we spoke of when we were in chapter 1, from chapter 1, verse 19, where Jesus basically gives an outline of the book of Revelation, or a timeline, if you will, where he tells John in chapter 1, verse 19, to write the things which you have seen, which is section 1, and that is specifically John's vision of Jesus in that chapter before that particular verse. Then he says, write the things which are, that's section 2, the letters to the churches, or the church age, which is what we just finished up. And then he says to write the things which will take place after this. And that's section 3, which is future events. And this is future not just for John then, but also for us presently as well. And this is the section we'll actually be starting today. So, section 1 covered the first chapter essentially of this book. Section 2, which we just finished, was contained in chapters 2 and 3. And section 3 takes us from chapter 4 all the way to the final chapter, chapter 22 of this book. So let's get right into it. Chapter 4, verse 1. After these things I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven. And the first voice which I heard was like a trumpet speaking with me, saying, Come up here, and I will show you the things which will take place after this. So beginning here in verse 1, John sees what's going to happen in the future after the church age. And for those who are still alive at the end of the church age, just how does the future from this point begin? Well, I'm glad you asked, because that depends entirely upon your relationship with God. Jesus reveals to John that those who are in a right relationship with God the Father through faith in Him are going to be taken to heaven to spend eternity with Him. And those who are not are going to be left behind to endure the wrath and the judgment of God during the Great Tribulation period. For these folks, the ones who are left behind, we won't see what the future holds for them until we get to chapter 6. And that's not going to be a pretty sight. For the church, however, the future begins right here in chapter 1. It says, After these things I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven. So after these things, after what things? After the church age that Jesus was describing to John through his letters to those 7 churches. It says, And behold, a door standing open in heaven. Now, the church age is fulfilled, and heaven is opened up, but only to those found worthy, those who have a relationship through God, with God through faith in Jesus. So then verse 1 goes on to say, And the first voice which I heard was like a trumpet, speaking with me, saying, Come up here, and I will show you the things which must take place after this. So, who was the first voice which he heard that was like a sound of a trumpet? Well, we find that answer back in chapter 1, in the beginning with verse 10, where it says, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice, as of a trumpet, saying, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last. And what you see, write in a book and send it to the 7 churches which are in Asia. This is again, as we learned when we looked at the breakdown of chapter 1 and the first section of our timeline, the voice of Jesus. And what he is saying this time in verse 1 of chapter 4, He's saying, come up here. Up where exactly? Well, let's listen to the words of Paul speaking of this very event in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 16 and 17. This is the BSB translation. It says, "For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a loud command, with the voice of an archangel, and with the trumpet of God. And the dead in Christ will be first to rise. After that, we who are alive and remain will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will always be with the Lord." This is a picture of the rapture. Jesus is allowing John to see and experience this event. And we are told that the believers who have already died will be caught up or raptured first. Then immediately after, in the twinkling of an eye, we're told, those believers who are still alive will be taken up to meet them in the air, to spend the rest of eternity in Jesus' presence. Then verse 1 ends with the Lord saying, "And I will show you the things which must take place after this." After this here is not the same as the "after these things" at the beginning of the verse. At the beginning of the verse, as we mentioned, he was referring to the end of the church age and then the rapture of the saints. At the end of the verse here, he's referring to immediately after the rapture, which, as we'll see, takes us from in the air with him and through the door standing open in heaven, and then directly into the throne room of God. Now, as I mentioned a couple times since we began the study of this book, there are some who claim that the concept of the rapture is not found in the Bible, and that the church will have to endure the tribulation period, and that it's a stretch to claim that verse 4 here is a picture or a symbol of the rapture. But I'd like to point out something here. Besides the fact that the parallels of the language in this verse and 1 Thessalonians 4, as well as the obvious point that the Bible is clear in many spots that God will not send his wrath upon his own people, we would be foolish to ignore the fact that Revelation 3:22 was the verse right before this one, is the last time in the entire Bible that we read the word church, until we get to the very last chapter of this Bible, which is Revelation chapter 22, where Jesus says these words, "I, Jesus, have sent my angel to give you this testimony for the churches." Now, we do see some texts in chapters 4 and 5 which allude to believers or the church in heaven, but not on earth. But there's no mention whatsoever after chapter 5 until you get to chapter 19. And that's when we'll see the Lord arrive in his second coming, and we'll see the church riding with him to set up his millennial kingdom. So why is the church not mentioned at all between chapter 6 and chapter 19? Well, it's because from this point forward, what John is seeing is future, namely the wrath of God being poured out onto the earth in judgment. And the church isn't mentioned because the church isn't on the earth. And the church isn't around because the Lord has already raptured them. And he has raptured them because his wrath is not meant for them or for us. The whole reason for the tribulation period is to punish a corrupt church. And the point of the rapture, the snatching away of the saints, is to save the believers from that very thing. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 9 through 10 tells us, the church, this is the BSB translation, "For God has not appointed us to suffer wrath, but to obtain salvation through the Lord Jesus Christ. He died for us so that whether we are awake or asleep, we may live together with him." I know of no good argument for claiming that believers will have to endure the Great Tribulation. It's just not found in the Bible. Okay, so are we ready to see what the throne room of God looks like? Now, what we need to keep in mind here is that John, even though he's seeing a special revelation from God, John is still human, and his eyes and his mind, along with his vocabulary, are all limited to human perception and thinking. And much of what he's about to see is beyond indescribable. He's describing this scene to the best of his ability. So let's jump into John's sandals here for a moment. Now I want you to try and clear your mind and attempt to comprehend something here. Just do your best with this. This is just to put us in the right place of mind. And closing your eyes may help. So, imagine that you walk into a room, and as soon as you shut the door, you see something. And it's something that you've never seen before. It's the strangest thing. It seems to be alive, but it's completely inanimate. It's definitely not a solid, but it's not a liquid either, and it's certainly not a vapor or a gas. It certainly seems to be round, but somehow it seems to have 6 corners also. It's a color that your eyes have never seen. It's brighter than any light you've ever seen, but it doesn't bother your eyes at all. Whatever this thing is, it seems to be constantly bellowing out loud, thunderous noises. And it's louder than anything you've ever experienced. But at the same time, it doesn't hurt your ears. In fact, it's quite soothing. It moves extremely slow, yet somehow manages to get from one side of the room to the other before you can even blink. Okay, now with all that in mind, try to describe the thing that you just imagined and make it make sense to somebody else. That's John's dilemma here. So, with that in mind, let's proceed to chapter 4, verses 2 and 3. He says, "Immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne set in heaven, and one sat on the throne. And he who sat there was like a jasper and a sardius stone in appearance. And there was a rainbow around the throne in appearance like an emerald." Now, in the Bible, when someone is pictured on a throne, it's always a symbol of someone with authority to judge. So keep that in mind. He says, like a jasper and a sardius stone in appearance. And I think we would all agree that the one sitting on the throne in heaven is sure to be God the Father. But there are 2 questions that usually come up here with this passage. First off, what does it mean that he is like these 2 gemstones in appearance? He obviously isn't manifested as a pile of shiny rocks sitting on a big chair in heaven. This is obviously figurative speech, not literal. He's saying here that he's indescribable. But secondly, what on earth are jasper and sardius? When you think of precious stones, do either of these stones usually come into your mind? I'm going to bet that these aren't stones that come to your mind. We think of diamonds, sapphires, emeralds, things like that. So what do these stones look like? And what is their significance? So sardius, other translations read carnelian, sardine stone, and ruby. Now the translation ruby, let's hit that one first, is actually a very poor translation, because a ruby and a sardius stone are actually 2 completely different gems. The translation sardine stone or carnelian are actually fairly good translations, because sardine is simply just an alternative term for sardius. So the 2 words are synonymous with one another. And a sardius stone is actually a type of carnelian stone. So in essence, it'd be like referring to a football player as an athlete. It's not an incorrect translation, it's just less specific. So a sardius can vary in colors, but it is most commonly a brilliant reddish orange gem. And the fact that it's usually red in color is more than likely why some translations read ruby. And I would imagine that the thought process here was probably most folks don't know what a sardius is, but everybody knows what a ruby looks like. But there's a problem with that line of thinking because it steals the depth of a much bigger picture here. And we'll look at why in just a bit. Pardon me. Now the jasper stone, the appeal of the jasper is interesting. It's got color patterns and formations. Though it can be a solid color, various colors, white, blue, red, green, yellow, orange, brown, gray, even black. Jaspers are more often than not mottled or spotted or even striped or ringed. And a jasper is actually a fairly common and affordable gemstone today. But long ago, it was regarded as an extremely precious and valuable gem. And there are also 27 different varieties of this particular gemstone, which leads to the idea that the one on the throne is limitless and indescribable. But gemstones in the Bible are a picture of something that is precious. They are also a picture of royalty. So both of these symbols are obviously in play here when describing the one on the throne. But is there significance with the reference of these particular two stones specifically, the sardius and the jasper? Well, let's look at an Old Testament passage. And I want us to consider something that I found to be extremely interesting. So in Exodus 28, verses 15 through 21, this is the passage we're going to look at. And this is God giving Moses specific instructions on how to make the garments of the high priest, Aaron, his brother. So starting in verse 15, it says, "You shall make the breastplate of judgment, artistically woven according to the workmanship of the ephod you shall make it. Of gold, blue, purple, and scarlet thread, and a fine woven linen you shall make it." Verse 16, "It shall be doubled into a square, a span shall be its length, and a span shall be its width. And you shall put settings of stones in it, 4 rows of stones. The first row shall be a sardius, a topaz, and an emerald. This shall be the first row. The second row shall be a turquoise, a sapphire, and a diamond. The third row a jacinth, an agate, and an amethyst. And the fourth row a beryl, an onyx, and a jasper. They shall be set in gold settings, and the stones shall have the names of the sons of Israel, 12 tribes according to their names, like the engravings of a signet, each one with its own name. They shall be according to the 12 tribes." So, the very first stone in the breastplate of judgment is the sardius stone. And the very last stone in this breastplate is the jasper. Plus, let's not overlook the fact that this is the breastplate of what? It's the breastplate of judgment. And as we've stated, someone sitting on a throne is always a picture of authority to judge. Everything about this picture of the throne and the one on the throne is a bold picture of authority and of sovereign rule. There's another thing I find interesting about the relationship between our verse here in Revelation 4:3 and the gems on the breastplate of judgment. And this point may or may not have significance. I tend to think that it definitely does. But notice that the passage here in Revelation reads that a glow like that of an emerald encircled the throne, like a rainbow. Well, when we look again at the gemstones on the breastplate of Aaron, the breastplate of judgment, in Exodus 28:20, the last row of the stones ends with the jasper stone. The two stones before that in the first row, the very first stone in the first row, or in that row, is the beryl stone. And in Exodus 28:17, the first row of stones starts with the sardius. And then 2 stones after that, the last stone in that row, we see an emerald. So the first row starts with a sardius and ends with an emerald. The last row starts with a beryl and ends with a jasper. So why am I pointing this out? If you study gemstones, namely emeralds, you'll find that an emerald is essentially a beryl stone. Beryl is a mineral that is found in different crystals and gems, the most common of which is the emerald. So in layman's terms, what I'm saying here is that the stone that is commonly referred to as a beryl is essentially an emerald that isn't finished cooking yet. In other words, if this beryl stays in the ground a little bit longer, it'll eventually become an emerald. So when we look at the 12 stones on this breastplate, positioned in 4 rows as they were, the first corner, the upper left, is a sardius stone. The second corner, upper right, is an emerald. The third corner, lower right, is a jasper. And the fourth corner, lower left, is a beryl, which in essence is another emerald. So when we read verse 3 here again in chapter 4 of Revelation, this is the New Living Translation, it says, "The one sitting on the throne was as brilliant as gemstones, like jasper and carnelian, or sardius, and the glow of an emerald encircled the throne like a rainbow." So the one who sits on the throne is as brilliant as the first and last stones of Aaron's breastplate, the breastplate of judgment. And the throne itself is encircled by the brilliance of the gemstones on the other 2 corners of this plate. Now, as I stated, there may be no significance there, but I'm of the opinion that it actually is very significant. And the main reason I believe that is because I don't believe there are any coincidences in the Bible. Either way, however, it's still a very interesting thing to point out. So I believe that God the Father is being presented there as the living, fully functional breastplate of righteousness, or breastplate of judgment, I should say. Sorry about that. So the glow of the emerald is said to encircle the throne like a rainbow. And the sign of the rainbow takes us back to the story of Noah and God's covenant with him. A rainbow in the scriptures is always a reminder to us that God is a covenant keeper. He never goes back on his word. He never forgets and he never changes. The throne tells us that God is sovereign. And because of this, he can do whatever he wants. The rainbow around the throne is a sign that although God can do whatever he desires, he always limits himself to his own promises. This is a powerful picture. God has the power and even the authority to wipe me out completely. But he doesn't because he promised that he wouldn't. That's beautiful. This living breastplate of judgment, the one with the authority to essentially annihilate at will, confines himself to within his own promise not to do so. So verse 4 goes on to say, around the throne were 24 thrones, and on the thrones I saw 24 elders sitting, clothed in white robes, and they had crowns of gold on their heads. So who are these 24 elders on these 24 thrones? First of all, it's important to note when trying to figure this one out that the term elder always refers to human beings. So that takes away any possibility of them being angelic beings. They're definitely people. Secondly, the term also always represents people of God specifically. So in the Old Testament, it always referenced the leaders of the Jewish nation. And in the New Testament, the term always referred to the leaders of the church. So some suggest that these 24 elders are the 12 apostles of Christ and the 12 sons of Jacob or Israel, or one representative from each tribe of Israel. The truth is, no one knows exactly because the Bible doesn't tell us. The Bible is not clear on their specific identities, but there are some things that we can learn from the scriptures that can lead us to some speculations or possibilities of who these elders are or what they symbolize. The first thing to consider is right here in Revelation 4:4. You focus on what they're wearing and where they are sitting. you'll notice that the 24 elders are seated on thrones. And a throne is a seat of power and authority. In the Bible, one of the things we're told is that we will reign with Christ. Ephesians even mentions that we are seated with him in the heavenly places. So this could simply mean that the 24 elders are a reference to the church. More specifically, the overcoming raptured church. If you recall in Revelation 3:21, Jesus told the overcomers in the church of Laodicea, "To him who overcomes, I will grant to sit with me on my throne, as I also overcame and sat with my Father on his throne." So they're dressed in white robes. The 24 elders were all dressed in white and wore crowns on their head. So to be dressed in white, specifically in a white robe, is symbolic of being clothed in the righteousness of Christ. The only ones who will ever be clothed in the righteousness of Christ are those who have been redeemed. We see this mentioned in other parts of this book. Revelation 3, verse 4 through 5, for example, Jesus says to the church in Sardis, "You have found a few names, even in Sardis, who have not defiled their garments, and they shall walk with me in white robes, for they are worthy. He who overcomes shall be clothed in white garments, and I will not blot his name out from the book of life, but I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels." So they're wearing crowns of gold also. And one of the things believers are promised is the crown of life. In Revelation 2:10, Jesus told the church in Smyrna, "Do not fear any of the things which you are about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and you will have tribulation 10 days. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life." And in James 1:12, we're told, "Blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him." So I believe our conclusion should be that this is an assembly of unnamed overcoming believers, chosen by the Lord as a representative of his church. Anything else we conclude from that is just merely speculation. Okay, so we just got a fairly good bite into the third section, the things which will take place after this, chapter 4. And we're going to stop right there. We'll get back into it, and we'll start up in chapter 4, verse 5 when we come back. I hope you're looking forward to it, and we will see you then. Keep your nose in that book.